My name is Goodall, and I work at Swansea University in South Wales. And I'm very, very pleased to be here. And one of the things that gives me hope every time I come to something like this is that there are people who are still interested. And there are people that really want to make things better for some of our most vulnerable young people. So without further ado, what I want to talk about is to set some of the scene. So I want to talk a little bit about what we know about parental engagement and what a lot of people think they know about parental engagement, which isn't the right thing. But before we start, I would like you to do something. Could you turn to the person next to you and tell them they're doing a good job? Just turn to the person. If you take a minute, notice how the room feels better. The room feels much lighter and everybody in here is smiling. When was the last time we told parents they were doing a good job? I have reached grandmother age, so I can now stop the parent in the street and say, you know, I've really enjoyed listening to you talk to your children. Don't do that if you aren't grandmother age, because it seems kind of odd. But if you're grandmother age, you can get away with it. We don't celebrate parenting enough. And there's a wonderful phrase, please don't quote this because I haven't published it yet, but parenting is the most difficult job you get no training for. And I think that's a really good phrase, but I don't have the publisher's permission to publish that yet. So the first thing I want to say is that when I talk about parents, I mean any adult with a significant caring responsibility for a child. So it could be a grandmother, it could be a grandfather, it could be an auntie, it could be uncle, it could be a sports coach, it could be a religious person. But I'm not going to keep saying that. I'm going to say parents, but please hear that when I say it. And to me, this is a matter of social justice. This isn't about raising achievement. It is about raising achievement, but it's a matter of social justice. We know that in most of the countries represented in this room, children from disadvantaged backgrounds don't do as well as children from advantaged backgrounds. And in the UK, the difference is stark. It's very, very stark. You can look at the outcomes of our final exams and say, okay, you came from the middle-class family, you did not. That is not fair. And that, I think, is inequitous. That's why I want to talk about social justice. So, I'm not going to read what's on here, but it gives you an idea. This is an international problem. And unfortunately, the OECD talks about students being resilient if they come from a disadvantaged background and they do well in school. They talk about the students being resilient. That is unfair. This is not about the student being resilient. It's about the system being inequitous. And we shouldn't have to teach children how to overcome a bad system. So how many of you are or have been teachers? Okay, every time you walked into a classroom, you were thinking how the people in the classroom could be different, right? How they could be different at the end. That's what a learning outcome is. Teachers are by nature change agents. Keep being change agents, please. You know, and there's this quote here, as long as these gaps exist, we can't see schooling as the great equalizer. And so often schools are asked to equalize in an equitous society. It's not that simple. And these are just some statistics that I'm sure you know about and you can relate to your own situation. But basically, there are an awful lot of people in poverty. In most of our countries, at least 25% of our people, 5 children out of every 20 facing significant problems with poverty. Not enough food, not enough heating. In this winter that's coming, vast majority of our children are going to face issues around heating, around keeping warm. This is a social justice issue. Whoops. Oh, I killed it. And it's not getting any better. The statistics are not getting any better, and that's without factoring in the long-term effects of COVID. And we know, you wouldn't be in this room if you didn't know, that what happens outside of school is really important. And the problem is we often say we need to fix the problem in school, but it's what happens outside of school that's really important. That does not mean that I'm blaming parents. And one of the things we really need to avoid is the idea that you're sitting there, you're not doing it right. It's not about telling parents they're not doing it right. I have a list of all of the citations, by the way. I'm an academic. I can send that to Esther. She can send it on. Is parental engagement and learning the answer to social equity? No. No, it's not. Can parental engagement in learning help offset some of the inequities that come from our system? I think it can. And that citation there is a fantastic literature review of parental engagement. It's really worth having a look at. Recommend that to your students if you've got students. And this, if you've seen me before, you've seen me use this quote. I use this quote all the time. This is from Kathy Silva and her team in Oxford. And what they were looking at was, does early years education make a difference? Not surprisingly, yes. Yes, it does. But what that came out that is startling, and I think what changed the direction of a lot of Kathy's work, is what's on the screen there. It's what parents do that matters, not who parents are. So again, if you're working with schools, if you're working with training teachers, I'm going to talk a lot about that, we need to get away from this idea of that kind of parent. That kind of, you know what that kind of parent is. And every school I've ever been in talks about that kind of parent. That kind of parent loves their children and wants the best for their children. And that's the thing. That's where we can come together. Words matter. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of these words. But effective parental engagement in learning takes place outside of school. And one of the big issues I constantly face, and the rest of you probably face with schools as well, is you talk about parental engagement and say, oh yeah, we get 98% of parents come into meetings. How many of you are parents? How effective were the school meetings that you had about your children? Yeah. I usually say, don't answer that if there's somebody that taught your children in the room, but I think we can probably avoid that. We know they don't work, and we know they're not effective. We need them because those middle band parents never hear anything about their kids other than a parents' evening, which is also a problem. But they're not effective, and that's not parental engagement. And we know it changes as children grow up, and Bill James' work is very clear about this. Direct help with homework, reading with children, that's really effective when they're little. Sitting down and reading with your teenagers might be effective. Wouldn't have worked with mine, they wouldn't have sat down with me. But asking them how their day's going is really effective, even if they don't answer. They have no intention of answering, but what they've told us is if somebody asks, they know they care. And I was really pleased when I heard that, because I have teenagers when I did that research, and as far as I know, they did absolutely nothing in formal education, because every day I would say, what'd you do today? Nothing. Fine. They both have degrees, they both, you know. But we also know that teaching matters and parents matter. Often at times when I give this, teachers feel, well, there's nothing I can do. Yeah, you can. It's about working in partnership. And PISA found that the average reading score was higher in countries where more parents discuss their children's progress on a teacher's initiative. So teachers saying to parents, can you have a word with your child in a nice way, or, you know, your child did a really good thing today, ask them about it, rather than your child acted up today. That has an effect. It's correlation, not causation, But these three words I think are really, really important. Learning, education, and schooling. And when we confuse them, there's where the issue comes. I love that little one. I just want to pick him or her up and help him. But learning is a process that leads to a change in the learner. And unfortunately, we often use learning when we mean education and schooling. But it's a process, it's not a product. And often, I have to, for every course I teach, I have to come up with these learning outcomes. And it's like, this is spurious. Unless I can talk to each individual student and note the change in them, but you know, I'm not going to change the university. It involves a change in and to the learner. So I'm hoping that you're learning, and throughout this conference we will learn from each other. I've already learned the name of a wonderful designer. I can go home now, I've learned something. Learners learn. And this is, I think, a really important thing. Learning isn't done unto people. I can tell you as much as I want to tell you, but the learning is happening inside. Does that make some sense? But we often miss that. And that's the citation. Education, and there's nothing like going back to the beginning and the early thing. Dewey talks about education being a process of living, not a preparation for living. And I've defined education as learning for a formal reason. So if there's a formal reason for the learning, I don't think I put my definition up there, but if there's a formal reason for the learning, then it's education, if there are formal rules. So sports is learning. Scouts is learning, is education. Scouts is learning. Sports, learning dance, because they're formal rules. Does that make some sense? Mm-hmm. Schooling, on the other hand, is the smallest of the circles. Program. So on the way here, Esther was pointing out, well, here's an Orthodox Jewish school, here's a Montessori school, here's this kind of school. We know what school means. We understand what school means. The three things do not mean the same. Learning is a very wide circle, education is a circle within it, and schooling, if it's all going very well, is a circle within that. Does that make some sense? I'm not sure the afternoon I spent in my girls' school learning how to sit down like a lady was actually schooling or education, but we learned how to sit down like ladies. I'm not sure how useful that was. And this is from Sidorkin, and I think this is a really good point. We have concentrated so much on schooling that we forget that the rest of education and learning exists. And I was known to rant for the last 2 years at this idea that schools were closed. Schools weren't closed at all. Teachers were still working. Young people were still learning. Schools were not closed. The school is not the building. Does that make some sense? And I think this point at the end is really important. We can't imagine how education could look differently because we're so stuck in this way of schooling. But the world has moved on, you know. And if you go back to the 15th century, you can see people ranting and saying, well, if you give students books, they'll never learn anything, they'll never memorize anything, which sounds very much like, well, if students have Google, they'll never learn anything. You know, these things haven't changed. I think if we can change the focus from schooling to learning, then life becomes very simple if we're talking about parents, because parents have been involved since the very beginning. If we had more time, I would ask you to turn to the person on your left and show them how to tie a shoe without using your hands. How many people have ever taught a young child how to tie their shoes? I'm not putting my hand all the way up because I'm not sure I ever actually succeeded. I think they may have learned on their own. Parents are involved in learning. And they're involved in learning how to walk, how to talk, how to interact with other people. If we can shift the focus to being learning, then it's obvious that parents are involved. And we can get rid of some of the detritus that gets in the way. And we have this discourse around the pandemic that really bothers me. And I don't know if it's the same where you're coming from, but there's this huge discourse around lost learning. And the Institute for Fiscal Studies in the UK has figured out how much money in salary the young people that have missed 2 years of learning are going to miss over their lifetime. As though everybody didn't miss those 2 years. It doesn't make any sense, but people are desperate to monetize it. But do we know what the learning has been lost? Yeah. But the discourse is lost learning, and it's not. And at least in the UK, we have a whole generation of young people that have learned how to cook. And the suggestion is they're probably a lot more fit than they were, because one of the big things that happened was somebody running Keep Fit things on TV, Joe Wicks. But basically, what they're saying is, well, there wasn't a professional teacher involved, the kids weren't in front of a teacher, therefore they weren't learning, which is ridiculous. And there's some really interesting stuff, and this again is an issue of social justice. Children that didn't have access to digital media, children that didn't have access to Wi-Fi. 15 miles from where I live, there's no Wi-Fi in the middle of the Welsh valleys, in some of the Welsh valleys. So it didn't matter whether they had the laptops, they couldn't connect. One of my students was talking about putting paper-based learning on ponies to take it to remote villages in Tibet. Not everybody was dealing with the same issues. That's a really interesting thing. Are we going to see greater gains from students in cultures that value independence? And one of the things that we're learning in Wales is that our older students are better at independent study than they were before the lockdown. And as a university lecturer, I'm really looking forward to getting students that are good at independent study. The status quo can be changed. We can get very defeatist, and we can think nothing can be changed, and this is just the way it is. This is a wonderful quote from somebody who was writing for PISA. The relationship between socioeconomic status and student achievement is not deterministic. We can change it, but only if we're willing to change it. And I think there are some things we can change. And the first thing to say is that this isn't an individual school problem, this is a systemic problem. But we need changes in families and communities and schools and systems. And the 3 things I think we need to change. First one is teacher training. Are any of you involved in training teachers? Please listen. Please listen. We've just done a nationwide survey in Wales, and it should be out very soon, but everything that you turn into Welsh Government has to be translated into Welsh, so they're busy translating all of our diagrams into Welsh at the moment. But we know that teachers are rarely trained across the world for effective parental engagement, and often, if they mention parents at all, it's in, well, this is how you have a difficult conversation. So there's a deficit model going on already. And we were told in Wales that, well, they'll get it when they go into school. But then students were reporting that their mentors were telling them, well, don't bother with the parents don't care. So we can't leave it to the mentors in the school. And also teachers can discourage and discount parents of color, parents of different ethnicities. If parental engagement doesn't look the same in their house as it looked in your house, then they may well discount it. And we have this culture of poverty discourse. It's prevalent in the UK policy, and it may well be prevalent. I'm hoping you can recognize it. It would be lovely if you didn't recognize this, if we have cultures that don't have it. But basically, it says all parents in poverty have the same issues, and none of them care about education. If they're poor, they don't care about education. And basically, it's their fault that they're poor. You know, you need to give up the cigarettes or the avocado on toast or whatever. It's this idea that poverty is a personal choice. And the idea is about 50 years old, and it was rejected by scholars about 49 years ago, and that's only because it takes a year to publish a paper. But policymakers love it. And if you read UK policy, it's all the way through, it's embedded in our policy. And it sees poverty as a personal choice, rather than as an outcome of societal issues. Does that make some sense? And you get comments from heads, well, they say they can't afford to send their kids on the trip, but they're out there smoking. Can you see, I mean, the two are not actually the same thing. And you don't know why that individual is smoking. And we have this, we need to move from talking about an achievement gap to talking about an educational debt. And this is Gloria Ladstone-Billings. This is not my idea, but I think it's an excellent one. But can you see how it changes the emphasis? It's no longer these students aren't achieving, but we as a society are failing our students, and I think that's an incredibly important change. Does that make some sense? You with me so far? It's Gloria Ladstone-Billings, you've got the citation. We are not fulfilling our obligations to all of our children. As long as you can say this group of children are going to fail, I can tell you right now which group of children is going to be most excluded in UK schools over the next year, and it's Gypsy Roma children. It's Gypsy children, not Gypsy Roma. Gypsy children and traveller children, boys, will be excluded more than any other group unless something radically changes. Why? Why would that be the case? We're failing the kids rather than the kids failing us. They're children. Parental engagement in children's learning, you know this, or you wouldn't be here, is the best lever we have for increasing achievement for all of our children, but it requires change. It requires willingness to change. It requires we change how we train our teachers, and we get involved, and we insist that this is part of training our teachers. We need to support staff to work with families. We're asking staff to do something they're not trained to do. That's not fair. If you brought in a new math system, you would train teachers on how to use the new math system. But we say, go support this parent engagement, but we haven't told them what parent engagement actually means. And we need to support parents to interact with teaching staff. A lot of parents have bad experiences of education and they see the school as a locus of shame. Well, I didn't go either. And I don't know what schools look like where you come from, but secondary schools in the UK look like prisons. There are all these big barriers and you have to sign in. And it's to keep children safe. But if you don't tell parents that, they just think it's there to keep them out. And we need to change society. Nothing small here, you know. Don't really do anything other than change society. We need targeted, responsive, culturally appropriate support for parents. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One example was a school in London that was talking to me about what they were doing, and they had a barbecue every summer for their families. What do you expect to eat at a barbecue? Meat. Most of their families were Somali. What's the problem? They don't eat meat. So you're basically saying, come to this meal and there's not going to be anything you can eat. Parents didn't come. When they changed it to a picnic, the parents came. Another school had how to deal with teenage behavior problems. I wouldn't go to that. I'm not going to admit my teenager's causing me problems. When they changed it to, I have a teenager, get me out of here, they had to go get more seats. Does that make some sense? It's about talking to the parents where they are. We need to design these in conjunction with parents. So often schools say to me, oh, I did all this and the parents didn't come. Did you ask them if that's what they wanted or needed? We've got to work with partnership with our families. And that means working with our families where they are. I remember I had teachers saying to me, every time my parents see somebody in a suit, they're in trouble. And every time they walk into a school, what do they see? They see men in ties with lanyards that will break away. The lanyards will break away if you try to strangle somebody, but the tie won't. If I'm going to strangle a teacher, I go for the tie. We also need to evaluate stuff effectively. Often, if you say to a school, well, how many people came? Oh, I don't remember. What materials do you use? Oh, I don't remember. We wouldn't do that with teaching. Those of you who are teachers or have been teachers, how many of you have houses full of empty yogurt pots and stuff that's going to come in handy eventually? Yeah. They only let me teach graduate students, and I still collect the yogurt pots. We need to evaluate things effectively. And you've probably seen this before. This is in the Creative Commons. You can use this. The teacher who created this is happy for people to use it. But in the first, you've got where society was maybe 15 years ago. In the second, you've got what you need to survive in society now. And if you're my height, you understand that because you spend a lot of time in supermarkets going, would you mind just getting that off the shelf for me? Getting in and out of Eurostar was an interesting experience when you're 5 feet tall and Eurostar is about 3.5 feet off the ground. What I'm aiming for, though, is to get rid of the fence. Aiming for liberation. And one of the things that I do with my students, and I think we should do with all of our teacher training students, is the first book I hand them is Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I haven't quite got to the point where I'm able to hand them Deschooling Society. I can't get my colleagues to agree with that. But this is about liberation. It's not about overcoming an unjust society. It's about raising a generation that will tear down the unjust society and build a just one.